Hi, everybody. Welcome to the ECOWind Knowledge Exchange webinar to hear how research from the programme will contribute to our understanding of environmental impact assessments and habitat regulations assessments in the UK. I'm Henk van Rijn, programme champion for ECOWind, and I'm going to introduce the webinar today. Before we hear from our speakers, let me give you a quick overview of the programme in case this is your first time hearing about ECOWind. ECOWind is a one-of-a-kind research programme set up to investigate the ecological effects of offshore wind farms on the environment. It's funded through a partnership with the Natural Environment Research Council, NERC, the Offshore Wind Evidence and Change Programme, OEC, led by seabed managers, the Crown Estate. We're also funded by Crown Estate Scotland with support from DEFRA. Now, there are 4 research projects running from 2022 to 2026, each exploring a different aspect of wind farm effects. These are ECOWINGS, Accelerate, Pelagio, and Bowie. You'll hear more about these in a moment. Now, perhaps the biggest thing that sets ECOWind slightly apart from other research programs is that from its inception, it has been assembled to be able to align scientific outputs with policy and industry needs to better deliver impacts from the research. So in today's webinar, our speakers will talk about some of their project outputs and how they can be useful for the EIA and HRA processes. And as you know, these are both major components of offshore wind farm consenting. Our speakers today are Professor Katrien van Landerheim from University of Bangor. She'll be talking about Accelerate. Now, Katrien can't make it, unfortunately, so she's sent through a video, which I'll play for us in a moment. We'll also be joined by Professor Beth Scott from the University of Aberdeen, who'll be talking about Pelagio. Dr. Kate Searle from Centre of Ecology and Hydrology, who'll be talking about ECOWINGS. I have a video to play for Kate, but Kate is also on the call to answer any of our questions, which is great. And finally, Dr. Krisha Mazik of University of Hull, who'll be talking about Project Bowie. Now, unfortunately, Krisha is unable to make the call today. So what we've done is put together a high-level outline of useful outputs that are coming out of the Bowie project for us to consider. So all attendees of the call here will be muted throughout the webinar, but you can ask questions or comment as we go along via the Q&A tab at the top of your screens. You can upvote any of these questions that you like to indicate your interest in that question. If we run out of time for questions at the end of the webinar, we'll pass these on to the panel so that they can be picked up afterwards. The webinar is being recorded and a copy will be uploaded to the ECOWIND's YouTube channel for future viewing if you wish to go back over anything covered today. So for now, though, we hope you enjoy the webinar. And I'm going to move us on to Katrien van Landerheim's video that she sent through of her slides. So bear with me for a moment while I get that up on your screens, and we should be going very soon. I just check that we've got the sound all connected up. One moment. There we go, and it should be working.
Hello everyone, my name is Katrien van Landerheim. I'm at Bangor University and I speak on behalf of the wider ECOWind Accelerate team here. And I show on the left a map of the Eastern Irish Sea, and you can see that all the habitat assemblage clusters that you find around the UK are all present in this area, in this Eastern Irish Sea. You also see the black polygons. They are the wind farms. The ones with a purple cross are the ones that are planned. So indeed, when the seabed is hosting most of the UK's benthic habitats, but also lots of infrastructure, offshore wind infrastructure, what will be the effect on the seabed? And considering that the seabed is hosting a wider ecosystem, what will be the effect on that ecosystem? So the ECOWind Accelerate project was born. This is ecological implications of accelerated seabed mobility around wind farms. And we look at the combined impacts of climate change and the offshore wind farms on seabed sediment mobility, as you can see there on 1. This will change the bed stress and it will change the way the sediment moves. Now, the sediment, especially in the Eastern Irish Sea with those different habitats, is often a mixture of different grain sizes left behind by the glaciers. And so the mobilization can actually bring quite a change from sand to gravel, or a mixture to pure sand, or the other way around. And so it will actually change how it supports the habitats. And so we will therefore have a look at the impact on the habitat distribution, the biodiversity, and the ecosystem services. And in number 3, you can see some animals will love it, others won't. For instance, sand eels, they only like pure sands, and they are the prey for seabirds. And so will they get what they expected? So we will also have a look at what the impact is of the seabed changes on the interaction between the habitat, the seabed habitat, the prey that depends on that habitat, and the seabird foraging as they depend on that prey. Now, as you can see on the left-hand side, we have lots and lots of partners on board. They have been very generous sharing their data, the data that we needed to do our observational work and our modeling work. And you can see all the funded institutions on the right-hand side. And together we're working very hard to co-locate information of the habitat, as you can see in those blue boxes on the right. So we're co-locating information of the habitat, the prey, and the seabirds. And that is the only way to get that fine scale relationship quantified, so we can actually see what the impacts are across the whole of the UK. This is one of the results nearly ready for delivery, and this is the combined impact of the climate crisis on the seabed, resulting in ecologically relevant seafloor change. Number 1 on the left, you can see a storm and the excess bed stress generated from that storm. And you can see in this particular storm, around the Dogger Bank in particular, this is up to 10 times or even more than 10 times the background bed stress. And the sea level rise in the future might compensate for some of that, because with a higher sea level, you will decouple the bed from the waves from that storm. But we've modeled this and it doesn't seem to make a huge impact. And in fact, in certain areas around the coast, some of that, because of the tidal range also increasing, it might actually strengthen the coupling of the bed with the waves. And number 2, you can see that the surface warming can lead to stronger stratification. And this is a modeled future change in the potential energy anomaly, which is a measure of stratification for this month of August by the end of the century. We can frame our results in a way that might be more useful to the offshore wind industry, and we can map out what exactly controls the seabed stresses at any one time or place. And you see an example in this slide and in this histogram, and we can also map that out spatially. So on the right-hand side, you can see the percentage contribution to the mean and the maximum stress, and also what that contribution is. So in red, you can see that this is wave dominant, and in blue, you can see this is current dominant. And of course, these are then again the drivers of change and what one might to focus on if you want to go and see the risk to that change. And then in the wake of a turbine, to make sure we get those physical processes right, we have an observational campaign offshore. We have several bed frames in the wake of a turbine, and we also geometrically downscale that setup in a big flume lab at HR Wallingford. And then we parameterize all that through numerical modeling, and we make sure that all of that corresponds and corroborates that evidence. And so that parameterization itself is really useful, because if we have confidence in that, then we can use it for the larger scale. And indeed, we can already see that there is a similar length scale for effects on the seabed bed forms. They're not always the same type of effects, but it seems that it'll reach about 17 times the turbine diameter. Here you see more details about the observational campaign offshore. So on the bottom left-hand side, you can see the monopile, the black circle around which you can find the seabed bathymetry map of the scar protection. And those yellow dots are the frames, the seabed frames with ADCPs. So 23 meters apart, 25 to 55, and nearly 200 meters away from this turbine. And then we geometrically scaled that in the lab. And on the right-hand side, you see a histogram of the excess bed stress that was generated from those data sets from those observations. And you can see that there's corroborating observations from the field and the lab, and that there is excess bed stress compared to the background stress up to 3.5 times near the turbine and up to 2 times in the far wake. So this is nearly 200 meters away from the turbine. Now, just to compare that to excess bet stress from one storm that was modelled, not particularly affecting the North Wales coast, but you can see that actually from this recent storm, you see that the bet stress was 5 times higher than the background stress. Of course, that wouldn't have lasted very long, but as you know, sometimes an impact on the seabed can be permanent. So now we know what the impacts on the bed can be from a physical perspective. We need to actually expand our knowledge of how that seabed relates to the species that live on the seabed. So expanding the knowledge of that association inside and outside the wind farms is a key component. And these, by all means, are absolutely not at all our results. This is really from a small, very small preliminary data set, but it shows you the workflow. It shows you that we are having the bed characterized in terms of the physical properties, and then we see what type of animals seem to prefer what type of bed. So that's the association that we're looking at. And at the bottom, you can see that we are collecting those images with a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV, where we go down the monopile itself, because we want to make sure we catch the rock armoring and the cables and the monopiles themselves as well. And this is where we also use the AUV, the Gavia, the autonomous underwater vehicle, to catch images of where cables are buried, where cables are exposed. So we're making sure we have these associations on the beds, but also on the infrastructure itself. And then, of course, we need to make sure that we know how the fish and the seabirds use that seabed as well. And to do so, we need to co-register data from the seabed, the fish, and the birds. So we do seabird tagging, we have video data from them as well. And as we see how they move, we can see when they dive, where they dive, how much energy they take to dive. And so we are assigning effectively the seabird behaviors and which of the different areas, which of the different habitats are more profitable from a prey perspective. And so we're getting the information from the fish, from acoustics, but also from trawling, etc. So we're getting all the information we need, all co-registered. And once again, very preliminary scanning of some of the data. We only just really started doing this, and we're collecting more data in the next season. But the point is that we're trying to see where the probability of encountering the prey and the seabirds is going to be higher as a function of the habitats, the seabed habitats. And so how does this impact and link to environmental impact assessments and HRA process? Well, per policy area, we have the plan level assessment on how best to model cumulative impacts. We and our project can actually give advice on what aspects of the future climate will impact the seabed stresses and how. And of course, this is ecologically relevant because this leads to habitat suitability driven from that. In terms of UK marine strategy, we hope at least we're doing some robust and rigorous assessments. We do have the time to do so, which is a luxury not always there when you're having to quickly do consultancy work. But we have that kind of assessment of seafloor integrity that could potentially be used in HRA. We're strengthening the capability of the confidence in the modeling approaches. We're trying to get that parameterization just right, as I've shown you. Hopefully, again, that should feed into robust parameterization of models used by consultants in EIAs. And I think the impact from the changes in the predator-prey interaction with conservation objectives in mind should also really impact the EIA and the confidence in the outcomes. In terms of the highly protected marine areas, understanding from an operational phase at least what the species and the habitats of conservation importance are doing will actually help the site selection and the monitoring strategy. That will help assess and manage the HPMAs to promote recovery of the features and the ecosystems services as a minimum, really, but really as a maximum, you should have net gain in mind. And in terms of net gain, that brings us to marine net gain. To help understand the baseline is really important. And I think we've discussed this in the past. This is a tricky thing to do. We hope to contribute into that space and to make sure that we know what the habitats inside and outside the wind farms would naturally be and what the changes are. And of course, these future modeled climate change scenarios are going to help provide the context within which the MNG may happen for key habitats and species. And then quite particularly in relation to the HRA process, the way we could contribute is in respect to screening, is that we are quantifying the potential for change to the whole of the UK seabed, and that generates a map of risk hotspots really. So potentially it can lead to a more effective screening process. In terms of the Eastern Irish Sea, we are making high resolution models, and they are considering the layouts of the offshore wind farms because our partners have provided us with those. And so potentially our outputs can be used directly in HRA. We will generate better knowledge of the habitats that support the designated species because we're making that link through the ecosystem functioning. In terms of appropriate assessment, we will be generating sensitivity indices for seabirds, which will highlight not just the impact, but also the significance of the impact from the changes to the seabed around the UK. And the second point there is that these will be ecologically relevant because we're looking at that connectivity between the seabed, the prey, and the predators that should be able to be used elsewhere, not necessarily everywhere, maybe not in the very deep waters, but it is more widely applicable, and it should be, with the ecological relevance that it has, used with some confidence. Then we look at the effects from offshore wind farms on the seabed in context of the environmental processes, like I've shown today, the storms. And of course, the storms and the background environmental changes that happen anyway, and that will happen even strongly in the future, they might also impact the effectiveness of mitigation over long term. So we hope that that has an impact in those assessments. What we hope to do is also advise regarding monitoring strategy. And as I've said before, that could potentially be done more effective when you know where the areas have most potential for change. In the end, we're trying to reduce the reasonable scientific doubt. We're using objective and scientific information, and we really do spend a bit of time on robust and rigorous analysis. We're testing, we're validating, so we are hoping that that workflow, but also the outputs themselves, will be used in that space with confidence. And then you have seen the team that we have on board. This includes the regulators, this includes the SNCBs. They're part of the team, and their advice has been incorporated from the start. And again, that should reduce the friction, that should reduce the doubt that comes with the results. And I thank you for your attention.
Hank, you're muted.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, everybody. I just wanted to thank Katrine for sending that video through, and you know, for sharing those insights with us. And apologies for some of the sound quality at the very start of the video there. I managed to work it out in the end. I'd like to move us on to our next speaker. It's Beth Scott from University of Aberdeen, who will be talking to us a little bit about the Pelagio project and some of the outputs there, how those relate to EIA and HRA. So Beth, over to you.
Okay, hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
So it should be coming up. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, and hear me. Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. Yes, I'm here. I'm the PI of Pelagio. So moving up off the seabed, we are looking at the pelagic environment and physics to ecosystem level assessments. And as you can see by the range of people we also have lots of groups helping us out with this. And I wanted to actually show this slide to get you to understand just the level of density of scientists that we have and industry and government people involved in this project. And a very quick overview of what ECOWind and Pelagio, how it fits into the ECOWind program, is there's three big areas, and Pelagio has three big work packages. So our first work packages is really looking at the physical effects. And by physical effects, we mean throughout the water column. So we're looking at bottom-up effects that can also be climate change effects. And the big theme running through our project is that we have these three scales: local, regional, and seasonal. In work package 2, this is where we're looking at predator to prey interactions and really trying to understand fish availability and how that provides foraging opportunities for upper trophic level. So we're very much focusing on planktivorous fish. And then in work package 3, we're trying to pull this all together with ecosystem level cumulative effects, where we are looking at the effects of top-down effects of the wind farms, but as well as fishing. And we're looking then at populations at all trophic levels. So what I wanted to get across to people here is that there are 3 main things that we think our work will help with. And what we'd like to do is work along with people as we maybe make some changes to some of the EIA and cumulative effects and HRA, and also especially post-consent monitoring. So the first one we really want to hammer home is this need to incorporate physical changes in the water column. We feel that's been missing, and especially changes to plankton. And I'll show you why we're saying that. So what I'm going to show you is what we've had a successful field season. And in fact, today I'm a little bit distracted because we're actually loading the boat and going out tomorrow for the second field season, where we run surveys, we set out gliders, we put down moorings, we run CTDs, and we're doing this all in collaboration with SSE at the Sea Green site. And we really shout out to how wonderful it has been working with them. And so we will this time be putting moorings down much more in the middle in their site. So the moorings that we're putting down, we've got a whole series of moorings. We put down 3 last year. We're putting down 5 this year because we've had wonderful additional funding from Scottish Power to buy what we're calling a new WBAT, and also Sonodyne have given us an instrument for free to test out. So we've put these in areas where we've put them, one of the ones, the WBAT before, that does both fish and physics, we put it 500 meters away, and then we brought it in and put it 50 meters away from one of the turbines last year. And to put it into the absolute tidal ellipse of that turbine. So what some of the things that have come out of this is with our glider work, we actually were out there with the massive heat wave that went on last year, 5 degrees above normal. It's just absolutely terrifying. But what we saw then, it was really quite different. The top of the water column sort of sealed off, and the bottom of the water column did not warm up that much, but it really made a difference to habitat, and we're incorporating that now. So there's a lot more going on with our fieldwork, and I'll come back to the moorings in a second. But what we're also doing in work package 1 is a lot of modeling. So we're, as I said, modeling at this local scale, regional scale, shelf-wide scale. And all of that data that we're bringing in to parameterize all of this. But I'll go into detail now about the scales we're looking at. So this is looking at the shelf-wide scale, and what it's doing is we're looking at both what happens under the water, the effect of the structure, the fact that the turbulence around the structure is increasing vertical mixing, and we've now got that incorporated into our model. And that we also have drag. And so what you're seeing on the right-hand side is the difference in this level of stratification. And what you're seeing is a lot of it seems to be south of the wind farm. And that is because this is the main tidal ellipse. And we do trying to understand why it's only south and not north. And that's what we'll be doing. We've changed our sampling this summer to actually go and investigate that. What we're also doing then is looking above water and looking at what happens when you extract energy out of the water column. And what you can see on the animation that's going here is that this is the effect of the extraction. And you can see, yes, this is using whole array effects, not individual turbines yet. But what we're showing here in the little graphs is the daily output, showing you that the overall amount of change in chlorophyll is not that big, but the temporal change is quite big, and that there's a big change in whether we get a positive or a negative increase in plankton, depending on the time of the year and whether we're in or out of the spring bloom. And so the 3 graphs at the bottom are really showing the difference between the maximum amount of maximum chlorophyll, that's chlorophyll down at the thermocline, during those 3 seasons, pre-bloom, bloom, and post-bloom. And what you see is there's a real temporal issue going on here. So what we also want to talk about is the fact that fish have kind of slightly been ignored, we think, in a lot of EIAs, and that we really need to measure them more explicitly, and that because this change in fish, as we know, will change distribution and behavior, and these changes will come up through the trophic change in collision risk, displacement effects, and also affecting fisheries. So how we're doing that is with our mooring. So here's back to the WBAT, which does both fish and physics, and looking at where we had placed it. And so what we have then from our combinations of our surveys and our moorings is, you see on the upper panel, we've left the moorings for months at a time. We can see these diel patterns of fish and zooplankton moving up and down. And then in our surveys, we can see fish schools, and I'll go into that a second. And so on our surveys, we're of course looking at birds and fish at the same time. And I don't know if you see these little dots. These are if you see my mouse, I'm not sure, there are bird numbers above and fish schools down below. And so we're doing a lot of analysis to actually think about when those fish are much more available to the birds, because we have this working hypothesis that we think fish are more available when they themselves are foraging. So we're focusing in on foraging fish. And as I said, we've then placed this mooring much closer to the turbine. This year, we'll have 2 of these moorings out, one for downwind and one for down tide. And what we have to do, and of course, if you're going to look at fish, you have to try to figure out fish ID. And so far with our work, we've figured out that most of the fish that we're looking at is probably sand eels in the area we're working now. What we're getting to, we think, with the birds is what we're trying to do, showing this schematic, is that we know that the physics are affecting the fish, and we know that the birds then are tied to fishing, where fish are. We'd love to get to a point where we can go straight from the physics to the birds. And so what we're doing now in the second half of Pelagio is we are bringing in all the new tagging data that's been going on last year, will go on this year with RSPB, but also we've now collated all of the 2004 to 2023 tagged data from a range of seabirds that we're about to investigate with our larger scale models. And for the last thing we talk about is we really feel that cumulative effects, true cumulative effects, is not so much an adding up across within species, but trying to look at these ecosystem modeling approaches. So what we've done is we've decided to go on a Bayesian approach, i.e. a machine learning approach, where we've used the huge amounts of information that we have in the North Sea and done runs for 33 years. And this is just one example of showing what you've got is the recruitment of cod from 1990 to the 2020. And what you see in the red is, or orangey color, is the real data coming through. And what you see in the blue is the predicted data coming through. And the things that are predicting that recruitment are the mixed layer depth, the maximum chlorophyll level, and the landings of demersal fish. And actually maximum chlorophyll level is the variable that does the most prediction. So this is a pattern recognition approach to looking at this, but it really does quite well. And so what we can do with that is we've been then working directly with the fishing industry, running scenarios that they themselves have suggested to us that look at no fishing allowed to no fishing in mobile or no mobile gear, only in floating wind, and so forth and so on. And we've also been questioning fishermen. So very, very briefly, and I know this is a lot of information, what we've been able to do is run those baseline changes from looking at the effects. Then first of all, I'm just showing the effects of climate change. So here what we've done is warm up the water by 1 degree. Therefore, that changes this level of stratification, and that also changes what we've done is a scenario of good plankton or bad plankton, i.e. a 10% change is green going up and a 10% change of lowering the plankton is going down. So these are just scenarios. And across the bottom, what you see is the different species of fish on the left-hand side and the different species of guillemots. So for fish, that's recruitment rates, that's the change in baseline. And for seabirds, that's the change in breeding success. And what you see is there's quite a variety of species that are reacting very differently to this scenario. What we then did is change fishing. And so what we're showing here is the scenario where we don't allow mobile gear into floating wind. And here is, again, very, very quickly, there's a lot of information on this slide, I know, but just look at that orangey bit there. This is then looking at the species of fish again, from sand eels, herring, sprat, haddock, and cod, and then looking at recruitment changes, and then looking at changes in the seabird breeding success. And what you see, what's quite different with this from everything else, is that everything here actually is positive, even the negative. So it is saying that fishing has quite an effect, but that changing fishing, just keeping fishing out of mobile fishing out of the floating wind has the lowest effect of actually shutting down fishing much more severely. So that is us in a nutshell, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Beth. I've checked my microphone is working this time as well, which helps. But really, really interesting always to see the result, some of the studies coming out there, and looking like you've made a lot of progress with looking for some of the associations between the different trophic levels there and the environmental parameters. Really look forward to hearing a bit more about how that goes. And also, you've got a question there that we can pick up at the end of all the talks. So thanks again. And I'm going to move us on to our next speaker. Kate Searle has sent through a recorded presentation, which I will now bring up on your screens. Let's make sure I connect it up correctly. And that should be it there.
Hello, so my name is Kate Searle and I'm presenting on the ecosystem change, offshore wind net gain and seabirds, or the ECOWINGS project. So ECOWINGS is addressing three main questions. The study area for ECOWINGS is in the North Sea, and the project's focused on these three research questions. Firstly, what are the cumulative impacts of offshore wind on seabirds and the wider ecosystem? Secondly, which strategic compensatory measures will deliver net gain to seabirds and the wider ecosystem? And thirdly, how can we incorporate sufficient headroom for climate change that's predicted to continue into the future? And in this talk, I'll provide a summary of our work under these themes and their relevance to EIA and HRA. So there's a requirement for rapid tools for cumulative impact assessment, especially at larger spatial scales. And this is becoming increasingly important as people like yourselves grapple with a more complex policy landscape. And current models for estimating cumulative effects tend to either be quite crude or simple, or alternatively are sophisticated but not very scalable, such as individual-based models, including the IBM Seaboard, which this project team has developed. So to properly account for cumulative effects, we also need to incorporate hierarchies of key ecological processes that shape interactions from small scales up to these large regions, and ultimately to cover the whole of the North Sea. So here in our project, we're using emulation to identify components of the IBM model that can be simplified whilst maintaining accuracy in order to deliver a rapid, more scalable model of cumulative impacts at the North Sea scale. So to inform the development of this tool, we're estimating cumulative impacts of offshore wind on seabirds by estimating where seabirds obtain their food at sea using existing data. And we can then overlay scenarios of offshore wind development footprints and estimate the demographic consequences of a potential loss of prey as a result of displacement from these scenarios of wind farms. ECOWINGS is also collecting new data, and there's a striking lack of existing simultaneous high-resolution data on fish and seabird distributions. And these data are important because we expect that the effects of offshore wind on seabirds are likely to operate at small spatial scales. And a key question is whether birds are directly disturbed and displaced from wind farms, or alternatively whether fish are displaced and birds are responding to changes in their prey. So we're conducting a series of surveys in 2024 and 2025 using USV and AUV uncrewed vessels to estimate prey density right through the water column, and to relate these to bird surveys from aeroplanes and other methods currently being conducted in the region at the same time and funded by the Forte wind farm developers. And then using advanced statistical methods, we'll be estimating the effects of offshore wind on seabirds at the prey patch scale, and weaving this new process-based understanding into our CIA tool to estimate impacts at regional scales. So in terms of our second objective around providing evidence to inform development of strategic compensatory measures, here we're considering measures that act directly on the survival and productivity of seabirds, such as predator management, nest site creation and bycatch, as well as those that act indirectly by benefiting prey populations such as fisheries management and habitat restoration. And one of the significant challenges with compensatory measures is the lack of empirical evidence in terms of their effectiveness. So in situations such as this, expert opinion can be gathered through a formal process called expert elicitation. And this is where experts provide estimates of effects with uncertainty, and disparate views across experts are captured and incorporated. So in ECOWINGS, we've conducted an expert elicitation across the suite of compensatory measures, where we asked experts to rank the measures on their potential effectiveness for different species, and then to estimate changes in seabird survival and productivity for the top-ranked measures. So each expert provided a mean, lower, and upper limits on their estimates, and these were translated into a statistical distribution shown in the graph here. And we're now building estimates of changes in demographic rates from the expert elicitation and from empirical evidence where available into population models, which we're using to look at the capacity for compensating seabirds for predicted impacts of offshore wind and also to potentially achieve net gain. And these estimates will be made freely available for people to use within the next few weeks in their assessments. So we've also taken the opportunity to undertake empirical analyses where data allow for this. So we've investigated the effectiveness of the closed area for sandal fisheries off the Scottish East Coast, which has been in place since 2000. And here we compare breeding success during the period the fishery was operating at colonies within that region, and compared this to a control set of colonies outside the area. And we did this for both before, during, and after the fishery took place, as shown in the main plot. So for kittiwake, we found that breeding success was lower when the fishery was operating at colonies that overlapped with the fishery, and this is shown in black in the middle period of the graph. But this wasn't the case in the control area, shown here in orange. However, after the fishery closed, there was only a partial recovery in breeding success of those colonies, suggesting that there is an ongoing environmental deterioration that limits the effectiveness of the closure. And we're currently completing an analysis of the effects of the fishery closure on seabird survival to complement this analysis on breeding success. And we're very keen to understand whether these results are mainly relevant to the recent announcements on sand eel fishery policies, or alternatively, whether this closure could also play a role in other policy areas such as compensatory measures and marine net gain. So in our second objective, focusing more on the whole ecosystem, we're working with Strath E2E, which is a model that simulates end-to-end food web dynamics, including all components of the North Sea ecosystem, which is driven by physical and chemical oceanographic inputs, as well as fishing effort. And in ECOWINGS, we've adapted this model to include offshore wind farm impacts on all ecosystem elements, shown in an illustrative example on the right here. And the model can investigate effects right across the food web, helping to identify any unintended consequences arising from trophic interactions. And we've also incorporated compensatory measures, and we've shown that measures that affect seabird food indirectly, for example, by habitat restoration or creation, are likely to be most effective in increasing seabird biomass in the North Sea. And then in objective 3, around incorporating sufficient climate headroom, we're tackling this question through a series of linked models on physics and biogeochemistry, on zooplankton abundance, and on sand eel and sprat energy budgets. And we're currently using machine learning to obtain rapid results on the effects of physical processes and productivity on zooplankton abundance. And then we'll be developing mechanistic zooplankton model called TRAIN to understand whether trends in North Sea zooplankton have been caused by climate change. And these outputs then feed into investigations of changes in seabird population dynamics and the whole ecosystem model using Strath E2E. And this will ensure that we account for this shifting baseline. And central to this will be how multiple measures can be combined to deliver strategic compensation to offset offshore wind cumulative impacts at large scales, and what impact these measures will have on other sectors, in particular fisheries. So finally, just to conclude, in terms of cumulative effects, ECOWINGS will be sharing a new rapid regional CIA tool during 2024 that will help those undertaking cumulative impacts on seabirds. For compensatory measures, we've undertaken an expert elicitation to provide estimates of potential benefits from different forms of compensation for seabirds. For ecosystem net gain, Strath-E2E can be used to explore scenarios of cumulative impacts and compensatory measures to estimate impacts not just on seabirds, but also on other species guilds and the whole ecosystem. And finally, for climate change, new models in ECOWINGs will predict the future effects of climate change on ecosystem components, and these can be used in the near future when shifting baselines are incorporated into impact assessments as expected. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kate, for sending in the video and for sharing all those points about the ECOWINGs research. And I've got a question or two myself, but I'll save that to the end. I also note that we've got a few questions in coming in now for Beth and Kate to have a look over. We'll come to those in a moment. What I'm going to do now is move on to our final ECOWind project. Is Project Bowie, benthic offshore wind interactions. As I mentioned earlier on at the start of the webinar, unfortunately, Krisha Mazik wasn't able to make the call today. So what we've done is just put together 2 slides to give a high-level overview of some of the research that's going on in Bowie, just so everyone in the webinar has an idea of what's happening there. So to begin with, the project is led by Professor Martin Solon from University of Southampton in collaboration also, like he also works with the National Oceanographic Centre. The main study area for Bowie is Liverpool Bay and the southern North Sea and the Outer Thames estuary areas. There's a collaboration with University of Southampton, Hull, East Anglia, CFAS and NOC in the project. And I think the things you're going to be perhaps most interested in here with Bowie are specifically what they're looking at. So they will be working with stakeholders and decision makers to understand the knowledge gaps and the uncertainties around how marine ecosystems respond in expansion to offshore wind farm development. Okay, once they're building up an understanding of those knowledge gaps, and a lot of this is being done by bringing together GIS layers and looking to see how all the layers overlap and interact. In addition to that, they'll be using autonomous underwater vehicles and in combination with machine learning techniques to determine the dynamics of seabed invertebrates, fish communities, and how those interactions carry out across different species and habitats in relation to offshore wind farm development. They'll also be looking at species and ecosystem level responses to a variety of anthropogenic pressures. So some of the things we've already heard about across the other projects, but going into more depth and detail around sound, vibration, electromagnetic fields, and temperature. And as well as that, like some of the other ECOWind projects, bringing that together in the wider context of climate change. As we know, things are changing. Finally, looping back, bringing in that first objective and the other 2 there is there's an ambition to support policymakers in offshore wind farm decision making, and they're chiefly going to achieve this by developing a natural capital decision support system that will encompass ecological, social, and economic information to assist with decision making in this space. Now, to put a little bit of meat on the bones there, we've pulled out some of the outputs that will be coming out of this project. I did mention a GIS-based framework, and this will allow sort of numerous analyses to be carried out from across the entire UK continental shelf, but also narrowing into more regional and local scale analyses specific to wind farms, of course. I mentioned from their second and third work packages that they would be carrying out sort of a lot of anthropogenic pressure investigations. So what you can look out for there are impacts, a better understanding of impacts of species physiology, behavior, ecosystem functioning in general. then more specific effects of pile driving associated with well, the pile drive, the sound associated with pile driving, and the vibration associated with pile driving, and those effects on key demersal and pelagic fish species. Also, with pile driving, the impulsive vibration on key benthic invertebrates, and some high voltage cable studies looking at the effects of the electromagnetic field on demersal and pelagic and shellfish species. And I know there are gaps there in the evidence base on this, so we can all look forward to that. And finally, bringing in the temperature side, more localized changes with temperature that will be associated with the subsea power cables on those key benthic invertebrates. Bringing it together, the project will be looking at the combined effects of long-term anticipated future environmental conditions. I did mention the climate change aspects, and in addition to that, they'll be looking at sort of trawling and also short-term construction disturbance on benthic community structure and behavior. So it's not the whole shebang, but it's a whistle-stop tour through some of the outputs and main drivers behind the Bowie project. So that brings our presentations to a close, and we've now got about 15 minutes for some questions. So if I could invite the speakers back to sharing their cameras again, and if we could have you back for some of the questions, please. Thank you. So I think our first questionnaire, I've saved one for you, Kate, in a moment, but I think our first questions come through from Bill Turrell, Scottish Government. There is for you, Beth, and it's in relation to Bill's wondering about the southerly displacement of mixing effects that you're observing around the turbines, and he's wondering, is that southeasterly side there, do you think that's being affected by the tide and the residual circulation in that basin, or do you have any other ideas what could be underlying that mixing effect?
Yeah, and I would think Bill can answer this question better than we can, but that is exactly what we're going to answer using the FECOM 3D oceanographic modeling that we're running right now. We're running a baseline one for 10 years to look at this and to look at residual flows as well and see. A lot of residual flows in this area that far out are actually more easterly. So yeah, not quite sure exactly yet, but definitely we will be. And we have the means now to look at that with all of the data we're collecting.
Thanks, Beth. By the sound of it, Bill, you might know some of those answers yourself as well, but it's always good to ask if you're in doubt. So thank you for that. For Kate, I was actually in a meeting earlier today, and there's a question came up around the strategic compensation expert elicitation workshops that you ran last year, and that you would be producing information on that and a topic sheet. And the question I had was whether or not that is going to be Scottish specific, or whether those compensation recommendations outlines are going to be more of a UK-wide recommendation.
Yeah, thanks, Hank. They're very much UK-wide. So the experts that were involved were sort of 2/3 of them were from the UK. We also had some from outside of the UK that took part, but we asked them to focus on seabirds that breed within the UK when providing their estimates. So yeah, the intent was very much sort of provide a species level set of estimates for potential benefits for compensatory measures for 11 species of seabirds, but breeding in the UK.
That's good to know, Kate. I think being UK wide is going to be even more useful. So we're already looking forward to that. I can understand that's going to be out quite soon. quick shout out to Beth from Sally Kaiser, if I'm saying that correctly, who's really interested in a lot of this work and is interested in particular for any future fish, well, any fish related information that that she could look into reading. So I think that's one maybe just to be aware of, and we could get in touch with you afterwards, Beth, and maybe share like a reading list or something like that.
Yeah, I've put in the chat already. There's a special issue of Progress in Oceanography some years ago with Jonathan Sharples, myself, and Mark Innall, and the introductory chapter to that series is probably the easiest one to start to get into it. But that then covers physics to fish, all the reasonings for it, how to do it, what we found, and stuff. And then, yeah, that's one way. The introductory one is a good one.
That sounds like a good resource. Thanks for sharing that on. Another question for you, Kate, from Edward Bolger. Are there any plans to account for seabird turbine collision risk in the ECOWING's cumulative impact assessment model that you know of?
Yeah, so no, we're focusing on effects of displacement in the development of the tools that we're producing within ECOWINGs. And the reason for that really is because the current tools that are used for estimating impacts of displacement on seabirds, as I sort of mentioned, tend to range from quite simple, crude approaches to very complex data-hungry approaches. So what we wanted to do in ECOWINGs was sort of try and bridge that gap and produce a tool that sort of takes elements of both of those approaches and essentially creates a new methodology for estimating regional impacts much more rapidly than you can currently do, but with a higher level of accuracy.
Yes. Okay. That sounds good. Thanks, Kate. Beth, over to you. I've got a question around. Well, first of all, great talk, says Eleanor Skeet. Eleanor's also wondering, are you looking at turbidity in the seabird fish work, the seabird connectivity to fish work, as well as what's available in the water column? Visibility of fish to birds would also be presumed to be key. So I don't know if turbidity is in the models, is it?
Yes, it is, and yes, our gliders are looking at turbidity as well. Although, and in fact, of course, it's important, but we think it's very much more aspects such as internal waves and stuff that can bring fish from the thermocline down at 25 meters up to the surface for things like surface feeding kittiwake. So we're very much looking at a lot of the physical aspects, because out deep where we are, a lot of the birds, the diving birds, are going well down below its massive visibility issues. So we're really trying to focus this on deeper water areas where they get very stratified. That's what we're more worried about in terms of the changes. And yes, all of those things we are measuring though, and we'll put together between our surveys, our gliders, and our tagging studies.
Sounds great. I mean, I know a lot of the platforms that you're putting out have numerous sensors on them, so it's good to hear they also encompass turbidity. Great. Another question for you, Kate, from Samir Whitaker. Kate, Samir is curious if you could expand a little bit on the findings regarding habitat condition in relation to seabird biomass. So it's habitat condition to seabird biomass linkages.
Yeah, sure. I think you're probably asking about Mike Heath's work with the Strath ecosystem model in relation to compensatory measures. So what Mike did, so his model is an ecosystem model, so it considers trophic relationships sort of all throughout the ecosystem. And one of the first things we did with Mike was we sort of undertook an exercise to look at the various parameters within his ecosystem model and identify key parameters in his model that we thought could be altered by compensatory measures for seabirds. So essentially things like changes to sort of intake rate, growth rates, mortality rates, all aspects of the ecosystem, but that could be brought about by compensatory measures that people have identified for seabirds so far. So very much built on the expert elicitation that we did. And what Mike found when he looked at the sensitivity of seabird biomass in his ecosystem model is that the parameters which had by far the greatest benefit in terms of being able to increase the biomass of seabirds in his model were the ones that related to these bottom-up effects that were driven by changes in essentially the prey availability, probably through changes to habitat quality. So yeah, so I think that's probably what you were asking about, but that will also be coming out in the topic sheet, Henk, that you mentioned earlier in relation to compensatory measures. So there'll be a bit more explanation of that, but yeah.
Right.
Can I just jump in and say that there's total agreement between the pattern-based machine learning models, the Bayesian ecosystem models, and what Kate just said, that absolutely that's what we were showing as well, that the changes in seabird breeding success are coming through the lower trophic chain.
And these are models, Beth, that you're using in your project that are slightly different to the Strata E2E model, but the interesting thing is both types of models are beginning to show, well, in this instance, are showing like a similar result.
Yeah, the same drivers. So yes, Mikey's model is a very mechanistic model, and our Bayesian approach is a machine learning predictive model. And yeah, it's really quite good to see that they're coming up with pretty much the same drivers.
Yeah, it is. It's powerful results. I've got two questions from Paul Thompson now, and one, Paul, I'm going to hand on to the Bowie team. It's about the key, which benthic invertebrates are key for environment impact assessments and habitat regulations assessments. But the question I will pass on to Beth, if you don't mind, Beth, is sort of, it's about, I think it's data access, data availability. Paul's wondering about, so the residual flow information that's in and around the wind farms, was that carried out in the pre-consenting phases, and has that been made available? Is that widely available? Are there other people can get access to that sort of information too?
Oh yeah, and that's one of the reasons we chose these areas. There's so much background data that has been collected over many, many years. And that's what Bill is saying. Yeah, the residual flow is predicted to be southeast. And so seeing it north and more northeast or southeast, sorry, completely is sorry, what am I trying to say? The towards the coast is where the residual flow was predicted beforehand. So seeing it so much more southerly than easterly is what I'm trying to say, is the difference that we're seeing here. And we're wondering how much then that is the effect of the wind farm. And yeah, we have lots of pre-physical data. And that's what I'm saying. We're running a 10-year baseline right now without wind farms at a really, really fine physical scale to look at this in depth. But yes, that's what we know from beforehand, yeah.
Great. Thank you, Beth. Well, we're coming up to the end of our hour webinar now. There's one more question in there from Thomas, who we will pass on to Katrine, from Accelerate. Just before we wrap things up, I'm going to bring back another slide for us here, and is to leave you with just a little bit of information, really. But before that, if I could thank Beth and Kate and Katrine for sending in their talks today and for sharing all that information with us. It's really interesting, informative, and thank you all for attending the webinar. Before you go, if we quickly mention that you can keep up to date with ECOWind activity via the website. The details are on this slide here. And you can sign up there for the mailing list too. Also, if you want more precise contact information, message us via the email address there. So with that, we'll end the webinar, and I'll just say thank you very much all for listening and for coming today. Bye.